So, oh yeah, so jungle. That gets me to my next point. You're in Brazil, right?
Yeah, very much urban jungle,
Oh.
quite far away from any existing jungle. Well, Anyway, yeah, no, and yeah, I'm in the center of Sao Paulo, so the city of
Cool.
wider kind of metro area of 22 million. So it's big.
Yeah, the term urban jungle began as kind of a metaphor, but you're somewhat literally an urban jungle, I suppose.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, not really, because I mean it's not very green. It's a sea of high rises as far as I can see in either direction. Though maybe kind of 50 kilometers away, in direction of the coast, then you get a stretch of still remaining kind of Atlantic rainforest, which is like real and much more dense than the Amazon. Different type of like biome to the Amazon rainforest. So you do have that, but it's pretty really outside of the city. So
yeah, it's it's interesting. People have likened the direction of American politics to a Brazilianification.
yeah, Brazilianization, which is, I mean, I
Brazilianization.
put it Brazilianization. It's even more difficult to say in Portuguese, so it doesn't really work either.
Right. Yeah, I don't know how many syllables are involved there. 9, 10, 11. It's
Yeah, too many.
yeah. Um, I think I'm not as far to the left as you are. I'm somewhat of a I don't know, post neoliberal. So,
Right.
which the fact that neoliberal is still in there means I retain some of the things that I've learned from their sort of school of economics. Before the right became known as being sort of purely populist and oppositional, there was a lot of theory behind what they did, and free market theory was a big part of that. And the things I've read about how prices work and function and their utility and all of that. It's why I can never be that far to the left, really. I think there's a logic to that some on the left miss, always taking kind of a larger macro picture, not looking at the all the mundane functions of markets. But anyway, you are more solidly on the left, I think, of the Marxist tradition. Would
Yeah.
you say that's? Would you want to describe your background there?
Yeah. So no, I don't think I would aspire to be a communist, but I think that term has no meaning today. If you do describe yourself as that, it's just another consumer identity, albeit in the ideology supermarket. So, because there is no real movement, and the workers' movement underwent a historic defeat over the course of the 80s into the 90s. I don't think it really makes much sense. So, yeah, I end up having to draw on kind of whatever various different philosophical positions, and ending up kind of enumerating various ideological attributes. So, I would say I'm a modernist. I'm a humanist, and probably would no longer describe myself as a progressive. Because of the connotations that term now has today, and to a certain extent, perhaps the way that progressivism has become so dominant today, with its tacit assumption that, well, hey, it's 2023 and that means certain things, and not being very critical with regard to how the advance of time hasn't led to very much progress, in fact. And so I don't know, probably wouldn't use the term progressive. Marxist, perhaps, though, that brings with it a whole bunch of other baggage, so I'm not sure how much I would want to identify with that. But basically, if I'd be interested in kind of realizing what the bourgeois revolutions promised, 250 years ago, freedom, equality, and fraternity. I think those are good things. So
Post roughly 1989, 1991, this is familiar territory. All of this, the end of history, Francis Fukuyama, and now we're at the end of history, as the book that co-wrote title claims. So, since capitalism is the only game in town now, I wonder if the next big thing, the next big sort of reorientation of our social world, that such that it feels like a real clean break with the past. There's this kind of line of demarcation between then and now. the next big iteration, the next big stage of development will be within capitalism, I think. And now it's a battle between, what that vision is. You have these sort of neo-extractive industry in the form of Elon Musk. So yes, he's associated with tech, but he's associated with the kind of hardware-oriented, let's dig things up, let's build up and out sort of mentality. Whereas you have mostly the softer, greener side of tech, very just software-oriented, less into the proverbial flying car. So I think now with communism, almost communism, yes, and Marxism to some degree, somewhat of a sideshow and something from the past. I think that's how a lot of people sort of conceive of it. I think the next big stage of development will just be something within capitalism, and it's either going to be a sort of neo-Promethean industrial age thing like what Elon Musk is doing, or a more of a degrowth, anti-consumer but consumer sort of vision. Do you have any ideas about that? What things happening within capitalism, the sort of ideological divisions there?
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent one can overstate these ideological divisions because they aren't given a huge amount of theoretical elaboration. Degrowth to a certain extent, because it's associated with the left. I mean, the left intellectuals will tend to be more of them and more active in kind of elaborating what those ideas are. I have no truck with degrowth. I think I don't think economic growth, it's certainly in the developed countries, has the capacity to liberate us. But I also think that its absence, the absence of growth, is much worse than its presence. So, taking the world as a whole, there's still a lot of work that economic growth can do. And I think we've seen over the past decade what the political, social consequences are of low growth capitalism. It's pretty bad. It's pretty ugly. And it becomes, increasingly kind of struggles over limited resources, which necessarily favors those who already hold power. So especially in a situation where there isn't, working class organization, popular organization that can act as a kind of countervailing force in society, it's economic growth would be a good thing because there's more to spread around, even if that kind of has the evade class conflict. I think that's still better than what we are faced with now. So that's on the kind of degrowth side to the extent that it exists. But again, it's not, they're not masses organized into, pushing forward, seeing through degrowth politics. These are just kind of ideas that float around. And then on the other side, as you described, this sort of neo-Promethean side, I mean, that sounds a lot more exciting to my ears. Especially in the context in which of a capitalism, particularly Western capitalism, which has completely retreated from production over the past 40 years. I actually think that something like degrowth is an ideological reflection of that low growth capitalism, of a capitalism that has retreated from production and to the extent that production still carries on, because it obviously does, the material world is still being produced and reproduced, but it's being produced over there, right? It's being produced in factories that are outside of big cities, and especially in the East, right? It's in China and elsewhere. And so that, I think, has led to a whole range of kind of ideological disfigurations where people just basically are seeing the world and thinking about the world based on a kind of phony image of what the world is and how it actually works, because they've just written out production. Production just kind of happens automatically out there, and we can play with all these ideas in our heads about how we'd like the world to be. Okay, so what does that mean about the way that I would view kind of Elon Musk's neo-Prometheanism? I don't know how theoretically developed that is, those sorts of ideas are. And again, it's at the most a fraction of capital that is able to kind of represent that view. I don't think it's organized in any kind of popular democratic way. There aren't, political parties organized on that basis. Social movements, not either. So there's an element to which that politics, I suspect, is always kind of anti-democratic. It doesn't seem to be making any attempt to appeal to people. And as it is associated with a lot of kind of big tech thinkers, I don't know to what extent, you'd throw Peter Thiel into that. I'm interested, Dan, at what you think
Yeah,
about that.
I'd say Peter Thiel or Thiel. I think it's Thiel. I
Okay.
think Peter Thiel.
Yeah.
He's of that school too. I mean, he's the one who made the that quip about, we asked for flying cars, we got 140 characters, that kind of thing. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think
So I mean, so then it's very explicitly reactionary, anti-democratic. It doesn't even bother kind of playing the game of democracy, which nearly everybody does nowadays, right? Of kind of gesturing to the people and saying, no, I'm on the side of the people, and my opponents are on the side of the elites. Like Thiel is pretty explicit in being like, well, no, I'm just on the side of the elites. Yeah, where I'm with the winners. And that politics always ends up being, for all its kind of Promethean imagining, which kind of is the sexy part of it, it always relies on exclusion, on kind of also a kind of fiction where it has to, mentally and perhaps physically exclude or hygienize society. So there's society. What is its image of society that works? It's maybe kind of closed off, walled off, rich neighborhoods, elements of, tech industry, whatever it might be. And it kind of goes, okay, well, this is working well. And the problem then is just the rest of society. So we just need to get rid of the rest of society, or get away from the rest of society, which is a tendency within capitalism that's been going on for quite a while. There's a new book by Quinn Slobodian called The Zone, about this, about kind of whether it's special economic zones, export processing zones, and various others of its kind, which already exist. And so to a certain extent, I think that, that sort of neo-Prometheanism, if you're going to call it that, is just a kind of an attempt to accelerate that. But it doesn't, it's not a universalist ideology. Very explicitly not a universalist ideology, because it doesn't say, hey, capitalism has, or our vision of capitalism has a solution for the whole world. There's a kind of tacit recognition that it is only for a certain number of people, and the only way that it'll work is by cutting itself off from the rest of society. So, I guess to round this out, if you set up this opposition between kind of degrowth-ish kind of thought on the left and this kind of Peter Thiel vision, it's not, neither has masses of people organized behind it. Neither is particularly theoretically elaborate. Both rely on a kind of fake vision of society, one which kind of ignores production, and the other which kind of tries to ignore or get away from society. And neither really will kind of provide solution to capitalism's own contradictions. So, I don't see either having much popular appeal and being able to ultimately be successful and win out in either case.
Yeah, there's the direction that I've seen capitalist defenders take in recent years. It's become more sort of self-consciously elitist, more so contemptful of average folk. There was a time when capitalism was defended because, I mean, people can scoff at this, but it had a sort of humanistic consumer POV kind of angle to it. They were like, well, what's great about capitalism is that you can serve everyone's very unique and idiosyncratic interests. Everyone's got a different vision of what they want out of life, and the nuts and bolts of those visions are just lots of little things, little consumer items, and it's not so glorious when you liken it to people's vision of the good life being satisfied by imagining 20 different brands of cereal, but that was it. So it was sort of a somewhat laughable, not very heroic or grandiose, but it kind of had in mind the interests of the typical person. And when I've seen people like well, I mean, Elon Musk is, now that he's on Twitter and stuff, he has to sort of bark certain populist noises about letting the people's sort of contrarian opinions get through and all of that. But like a Peter Thiel and someone like Richard Hanania, I don't know if you know about that guy, kind of the George Mason school. A lot of them
Right.
have begun to defend capitalism precisely because it allows the best and brightest among us to sort of flex our muscle. And that just
Yeah.
goes to show how different they are from the plebs. So like they'll end up defending capitalism, but in a way that has nothing to do with sort of a welfare function when you're imagining society or
Yeah.
anything like that. They actually, yeah, they do want to kind of get to a society where they don't even need 99% of people. It's almost as if CEOs exist not to fulfill some kind of consumer approved good or service, but just to show you what the best and brightest can achieve. And aren't we all impressed by each other? It seems
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that sort of thing. It's becoming openly sort of disdainful and elitist in a way that even the Italian school of kind of elite theorists might not recognize.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and
No,
they
I
just
mean,
on them. Yeah.
yeah, no, I mean it's a continual sort of ratcheting down. Can you ratchet down? I know you ratchet up. Anyway, of what capitalism can promise to the extent that it probably becomes almost its inverse, right? It's the promise is so explicitly elitist. It includes a massive concession that basically the system doesn't work, right? That the system only works for some, and not just kind of some, but the broader majority, or yes, it creates inequality, but in the long run, a rising tide lifts all boats, or the technological progress will ultimately be it leads to reduced price of commodities, and therefore it gives access to everyone, even if it's more unequal. No, I mean, this is a step beyond that, right? It's not even promising that. And so I think, to a certain extent, the history of capitalism, or certainly the history of the past 200 years, to a certain extent, I referred earlier on to the bourgeois revolutions, from the spanning from the period of the late 18th century through to the mid 19th century. And if one compares the kind of self-confidence of the bourgeoisie from that period to today, they're miles apart. But as you already indicated, what's being promised today by some of these defenders of capitalism is already several steps down compared to what the sort of OG neoliberals claimed, or even the neoliberals who came to take power in the kind of 70s and 80s promised. Because as you say, there was a vision of freedom there. It was, as you say, like a very anti-heroic proposal. It's the public realm is no longer a stage on which people will act. You're basically told, you stay at home, do your pursue your private aims in life. You'll have a kind of degree of comfort. You'll be able to consume your desires, and that's basically it. Right. So I mean, that's not the greatest vision of freedom that's ever been devised. It's actually a pretty narrow one. Not not because of its just individualism, but because of its privatism, because of the kind of exercise of human capacities that it rests upon, is one where you basically just someone who goes to work, comes home, takes care of the family, and shops. That's it. You're not a subject which takes part in collective self-legislation, right? You're not changing the world. You're not governing, right? You're just kind of pursuing your little private life. And okay, but nevertheless, that presented some vision of freedom, because it said, forget the old kind of hidebound traditions and limitations and old public duties that said you have to do this and you have to be part of society. You can just go and kind of consume to your heart's content, and we're not going to be judgmental about it. The old moralism, we're going to drop that too. So, if you want to go out and consume your identity on the market, you're free to do so. And I think that vision of freedom, which was probably which kind of reached a high point in the 90s, we're already kind of well away from even that desiccated vision of freedom. Nowadays, I think a lot of people who would have been kind of whatever centrist neoliberals are now much more skeptical about freedom, don't really propose much, and if they're policymakers, they're carrying out policies which are very a kind of anti freedom, and that began with the war on terror and continued and accelerated incredibly through the pandemic. So the kind of old liberal slash neoliberal cause of freedom is very withered, and as you say, these kind of defenders of capitalism aren't even making their case, building their case on a kind of meritocracy, which is at least theoretically open to everyone. It's a kind of a meritocracy in which, like, okay, once you get in the door is shut, right? It's not a kind of universal vision where anyone can make it. Not everyone will make it, but anyone can make it. It's one where, basically the winners have to shut the door after themselves, to preserve what advances that they have as against the rest of society. So there isn't even really a promise there. There's no sell.
Yeah, well, the kind of market-oriented right has always been skeptical of the person on the ground. You'll see why I'm searching for these terms right now. I don't want to. They've always been skeptical of people in like political mode or citizen mode because they don't think they don't make great decisions. But the less contemptuous will say it's because of certain the cognitive demands on people in a mass democracy is just too great, so you can't really begrudge them for attempting to act in what appears to be somewhat incoherent fashion. They want different things out of public policy, contradictory things. People in political mode in a mass democracy can't make the greatest decisions just sort of as a function of what they can even know. It's not a normative sort of denunciation. And you can tell by the way I'm describing it, I'm actually sort of sympathetic to that view. I think it comes out of maybe public choice economics. I can't quite recall the school, Virginia School of Economics, applying sort of an economic lens to politics. But my point is, they've always been skeptical. The neoliberal right has always been skeptical of people in that mode, but they used to have a somewhat a more favorable view of them in consumer mode, which is kind of most of us all the time, even if we're not voting. We always have to. We always have to live in the physical world and deal with supply and demand and blah blah blah. So they were least respectful of the consumer needs and the kind of consumer sovereignty notion. Customer is always right, that kind of thing. Now I think the neoliberal right, oddly for people who think about markets so much, they've sort of completely discounted the typical person now. And they, even though we rely on them to to have division of labor and a sufficiently wealthy society, most people are really just a drag. And I wish they just kind of go away so the best and brightest among us can impress each other and just pursue excellence for, I guess, whatever remaining spectators who are not among them can appreciate. Maybe the typical trad person on Twitter with their Socrates bust for their profile pic or whatever. All of them can, I guess, be the onlookers of a new age of bold and traditional vision. Great architecture, once again, not ugly glass buildings. So this kind of this turn toward a valorization of elites and excellence in all realms has made even the neoliberal right sort of spiteful or contemptuous of the 99% who used to be the consumers they recognized were necessary. And
well, I mean, the neoliberal right is complicit with that, right? They it's their market which did it. The kind of cultural flattening and cultural democratization, and I would describe myself as a Democrat, a radical Democrat, but I don't think the democratization of culture is a good thing. I mean that in terms of question of judgment, right? The kind of flattening out and relativism with regard to kind of culture, I don't think is a good thing. I think everybody should have access to it, but that's, I would bracket that. That's a separate thing. Anyway, but it's a kind of a marketized vision of not just of culture, but the kind of consumption, where everything is equally tradable. Everything can be commodified and traded, and is equally valid. It's just a question of subjective wants and desires. And then to turn around in reaction to this world, which has been created, in which there is no real independent standard of value. The exercise of judgment is verboten because, you're not allowed to be judgmental nowadays. That's a world created by the advocates of the market. And then they turn around and kind of go, actually, no, we need to defend, kind of these beautiful old buildings, because that's when beauty really mattered. And, we had independent standards of judgment, and there was a question of cultural authority and blah 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 and all this stuff. That they.
Oh yeah, you're saying that, right? See, yes, the relativism inherent in consumer is king is now butting up against this all newfound love of objective standards of excellence. Those things are in tension.
Well, and and it's like the same people, I mean, it's like it's the guy who was, pushing forward the market as the solution to everything yesterday, who today is complaining that, well, actually everything is kind of completely flattened out, and we need to have now kind of return to old standards
Yeah.
of authority and tradition and judgment.
Yeah, see, I'm enough of a kind of market liberal to have been just fine with a hodgepodge of architectural styles which don't make any sense or are offensive to the, I don't know, Socratic mind or something. I was fine with that. I still have a kind of this kind of let the chips fall where they may. If there's a Burger King right next to an old church, so be it. So I am a kind of a 90s or 2000s right liberal in that sense, and yeah, I've been a little bit taken aback by the way that suddenly all these people who were just previously admirable for just making their way in the world and in the kind of small man vision of the world, again, like I say, not particularly heroic, not particularly grandiose, but that was just fine. And so now they seem to be turning on their prior more liberal but more market oriented selves, and I'm still kind of in that space.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I imagine that must be like, yeah, slightly arresting, because things have kind of, I mean, from your perspective, I imagine things have sort of moved on, right? Or you perceive the world kind of moving on, and I'm not sure that there's that many people who kind of defend your perspective nowadays.
I think
Nowadays either, or rather, I would maybe rephrase that. It's that those defending kind of the relativism of the market. I don't know how to exactly sum it up, but it's people on the left who do it, and don't do it explicitly because they're not pro-market. They're in fact kind of
right.
market agnostic, but by default, because they don't have a critique of the market, they are, they're the ones who still advocate for a certain vision of relativism, for a certain right to do as you desire for yourself without too much concern for social commitments and obligations. Indeed, the idea of kind of obligations to others is seen as, maybe kind of traditional or old-fashioned, or a gross restraint on one's individual liberty. And that's the left, or the kind of cultural left, liberal left, whatever, who's doing that. And so I think it kind of the standard bearers of that vision of the world has kind of shifted from the right liberals to the left liberals today.
Yeah, I think part of what has happened is that one of capitalism's own developments or products, i.e., social media, has subjected the what might still be a large faction of right liberals. It's pushed them into this kind of space where they hate their fellow Americans because of social media. They're seeing videos that sort of reinforce the idiocy of most people somehow. Like, here's another viral video of just social breakdown and people being impulsive morons. And I think maybe they've been so affected by one particular strain of development within capitalism, i.e., social media, that it sort of psyched them out in a way. And so now they can't be as respectful of consumer sovereignty. They see what were previously consumers to be just a bunch of moronic people acting in political or citizen mode 24/7, and they don't like the results. So a development within capitalism has turned these rightists against capitalism, but it's largely sort of image based and impressionistic. Media, less sort of concrete material. So that might be one reason why they've turned. But again, it's capitalism, in a kind of Daniel Bell or Two Cheers for Capitalism sense, or cultural contradictions of capitalism rather. They can no longer look away from the cultural outcomes of that.
Right.
Social media, and it's really souring them.
Yeah. No, I think that's right, and actually, like, Daniel Bell's insights are probably more correct, at least kind of as an observation, than they were when he was writing kind of in the 50s and 60s. I think there's definitely the kind of the revenge of the cultural contradictions of capitalism are hitting pretty hard right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I don't know if Daniel Bell is considered part of a neoconservative school, maybe adjacent somehow, but Irving Kristol. Yes, it was Irving Kristol who wrote the Two Cheers for Capitalism. Either it was an essay or a book, but it's only two cheers and not three because of these kind of observations of Daniel Bell, or the thing I just kind of outlined before with conservatives spending so much time on social media, they can no longer have this sort of, I don't know, warm Jeffersonian / consumerist vision of humanity anymore. But yeah, even the neoconservatives, which we think of as being, big market boosters, they were always somewhat hesitant to go full scale Ayn Rand. So,
well, I mean, yeah, and I mean Daniel Bell certainly I think unfairly lumped in that school. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm a huge Daniel Bell fan myself, but I mean, described himself explicitly as economically a socialist. So I don't think it can be fairly grouped there, but certainly culturally he described himself as culturally conservative and politically liberal. So a kind of configuration of kind of cultural, social, and economic positions which don't really fit. Probably didn't fit so much then at the time, but certainly today doesn't really find any political representation, right? In fact, that as it happens, it's something that I've been saying for a while. Like the biggest political open goal in Western politics is a kind of, culturally conservative but not reactionary politics, which is economically welfarist, right? And you get intimations of that in the kind of Trump campaign, for example. But it never really sees it through, right? It always ends up defaulting to a kind of more, if not market based, then certainly a kind of more elitist politics, rather than a welfarist one. So it's kind of amazing. I think that it's almost testament to the kind of bankruptcy and of political systems, of the kind of withered nature of Western democracy, that no parties really have risen and had success in kind of in representing that view, that perspective, which by looking at all kind of surveys and opinion polls would be probably the kind of majoritarian position, kind of across the board. But both kind of politicized factions of left and right kind of prohibited from actually emerging in earnest, because the left will call it fascist and the right will react to it for being socialist. And it's not my politics as it happens specifically, but it's just as an observation. An economically left welfarist politics, which is also culturally conservative, would seem to me to kind of tick the most boxes for the greatest number of people today.
Yeah, it's interesting that quadrant on the kind of political map, it's underserved.
Yeah.
And even when the Trump phenomenon first started making noise, people thought that he might fulfill that, but his lack of ideology, which lacking ideology can be good and bad, but I think we started to see why his lacking one was bad. Economically, he just ended up behaving pretty much like a Reaganite, because the group of advisors that he might tap, that's all they know. That's where they come from. So there's no like I don't know, even sort of para-university system to feed that kind of thing. It's kind of economically conservative. But some of these terms are they're different outside the U.S. So, but yes, economically conservative, I guess, but conservative in the non-U.S. Economically liberal is the conservative position in the U.S. It gets confusing. But yeah, social issue right, economic left, that whole space seems somewhat underserved. It's true. And it seems like in South America, they will sort of swing violently from one side to the other. It'll be like an overly authoritarian right, or a populist left.
Yeah. I mean, I think South America, it's always kind of difficult to kind of map these things on. Latin America, it's much more. Things still conform a little bit more to a traditional left-right spectrum, where the left positions are grouped together and the right positions are grouped together, but with the caveat that the left end of the spectrum is more or less chopped off. I mean, it has its kind of, people talk about, Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela, but that it's kind of an exception, and to the extent, and it's debatable how kind of left wing they actually are. I mean, but that leaving that aside, there's the kind of trope that the Cold War never ended in Latin America, and to a certain extent that remains true, or certainly to the extent that the kind of ideological scrambling of coordinates, which is so obvious in the West today, it hasn't reached Latin America yet. And I'm also resistant to just seeing kind of peripheral or semi-peripheral parts of the world as merely just behind the most advanced parts. Like, oh, it's just a matter of time until they get there. I think they're structurally in a position where sometimes these politics don't just emerge. In any case, kind of leaving that to one side, the kind of cultural scrambling, such that left and right seem to not even, to mean almost the opposite of what they once did in certain instances, is something which is really particular to especially the Anglo sphere, but increasingly, I guess, across all of the West.